Hi there friends and welcome back. This is Jennifer McGuire. So today I've got a super long video for you, but I am sharing 10 ways to use stitching dies. Now some of these ways are different stitches that you can use for different looks, but then some of the options are when you don't want to do stitching, but still use the die for a new look. I'll be honest, I love stitching on paper. I find it very therapeutic. Some people like to color, some people like to paint. For me, I like to stitch, and it's something that I can do on the go. Now, I have a lot of examples for you. Even Lila has a few in here too. I do want to say I am not an expert at any of this, and I probably don't use all of the right terms. You could call this embroidery or stitching or sewing or whatever. I'm just keeping it simple and calling it stitching on cards. Now, for most of my stitching today, I'm using these two dies from the stamp market. We have the dotted rainbow and the dotted hello die. I use these dies with heavyweight cardstock, and you just run it through your die cut machine and it creates the tiny little holes. There are many stitching dies on the market, and I know of some coming out from other companies soon. I think this is a popular trend right now, and I'm really excited because I enjoy it so much. After I run it through the die cut machine, I just use a craft pick to pop out all the little holes, and I leave a trail of these little dots behind me wherever I go. Okay, let's start with the examples that involve different types of stitching. Again, I'm not an expert at this, but I'll just show you what I've learned has worked for me. There are 3 different types of floss or thread that I use when doing stitching, and I'll show you a close-up comparison of these 3. These are all from DMC. I've already put my thread onto plastic bobbins to keep them organized. Okay, so the first one I like to use is DMC Pearl Cotton size 3. That's the purple one that you see here. It's the thickest of all the options and works best with the dies I use today. In the middle is DMC Pearl Cotton size 5, which is a little thinner, and I usually use that for the more complicated stitched cards I do. Then the last option is the DMC 6-ply floss. You can separate those plies, and that's what I used to use for cross stitch a lot. Again, for today's video and these simple stitched cards, I'll be using the size 3, which is the purple. But in my past videos where I do more complicated stitching like the ones you see here, these are all done on cardstock, I usually use the size 5. If you're interested in this type of stitching that is a little bit more involved and where you can create your own patterns, I will link to that video up here in the top right and below. Again, today I'm doing much simpler cards. You can see I've done quite a few backgrounds like this. I find that stitching helps me with my anxiety, so I will often stitch at baseball games, when I'm traveling, when I'm waiting in the carpool line. It's just something to keep my hands busy. Okay, let's get back to the simple stitching cards for today. I will link below to the different types of needles that I use, but all I do is I feed the string through the needle and then leave a long tail on it. That way I can adjust the length of the thread as I'm stitching. When I start, I like to tape the end of my floss at the back of my card, and I'll explain more about that later. Let's get started with the different types of stitch that I do. There are 4 that I like to do, and they all have a different look to them. The first is the stem stitch. This looks like twisted string that's floating on the front of your card. It's pretty cool and very easy to do. Okay, for this stem stitch, you go up the first hole, then you skip a hole and go down. So I'm going to skip a hole here, go down, and as I'm doing that, I'm going to pull that loop aside with my thumb so I can go back up that hole that I skipped, and I tighten that. Then I'll do the exact same thing. I'm going to skip a hole, hold that thread over to the side, and then go up that hole that we skipped. And I'm going to continue to do this over and over. And what ends up happening is you get this twisted look that looks like it's floating on the front of your card. Just make sure that each time you pull the string over to the same side. So see how I'm pulling it over to the left with my thumb? I always will pull to the left when doing the stem stitch. I'm going to go through these stitches pretty quickly, but I will provide a link below to a stitch expert or an embroidery expert who has photos of step-by-step for each of these stitches if you find that more helpful. But again, every time I go up one hole, pull the thread to the side, skip a hole, and then come back up the hole that I skipped. Once you do this stitch a few times, it becomes very quick and easy to do. So when I reach the end, I do one last little stitch, so it's like a half stitch. And then I like to tape the end back on the back side. And I'll show you how to finish that off later on. Here's a closer look at that stitch and how it looks like twisted string that's floating. By the way, the back looks beautiful on this too, and we'll talk about that later. The next unique type of stitch that works great for simple stitching on cards is the chain stitch. And by the way, I'm starting with the more complicated stitches and then we'll move to the simpler ones. I also like to think of this one as a loop stitch just because that's what you're doing the whole time you're stitching. You come up the first hole and you're going to create a loop with your thread, and I like to hold the loop with my thumb. Then I go down the same hole again, and there you can see the loop that we formed. Now I'm going up the next hole and making sure my needle goes through that loop. Then we pull that tight. I hold my thumb again to create another loop. So I'm going to go down the same hole again. So we're going back through the first loop. Hold the thread with my thumb so that we form another loop. So we'll go back up through the next hole and again through that loop. Pull tight. Hold the thread with our thumb to create another loop. And take the needle back through the last loop. So we're going to continue to do this. So basically we're creating loops each time, coming up the loops so that everything stays connected. This will create a look that looks like a chain going across the front of your card. I'm using the thicker size 3 floss here, so this stitch will look a little bit fluffier. If you want it to be more narrow, you can use one of the thinner flosses. Now when I get to the end of a chain stitch, it's really easy to finish. So you can see here how I'm going up and down the loops as I showed you. When I get to the last hole, I'm going to go back down the same hole, not worrying about creating a loop, but I want to make sure my needle goes to the side of the loop. See how it's going to the side of the loop? And then I just pull to the back, and there we have our finished chain stitch. So there you can see a comparison between the two and how they give different looks. The chain stitch tends to be wider. Next, let's do the back stitch, which is a very common stitch and what I think most people do when sewing on their cards. For this one, you're going to start on the back and go up and then go down the next hole. So I created a simple stitch there. Then we're going to go up the next hole and then we're going to do the back stitch. See how I'm going back and going down again. So you're basically creating stitch after stitch. Go up that last hole, down the next one, up the next one, but then we had that empty spot, so we have to go back a stitch. And I'll just continue to do this until I cover the entire line. This gives it the most simple look, I would say, where you kind of have a straight line of stitches. And you can see it's the narrowest of the options I've shown so far. Okay, the fourth type of stitch I wanted to share is definitely the easiest, and it gives a look similar to the back stitch, which we just did. This is the stitch that's the favorite of my daughter Lila, who's 7, so she wanted to demonstrate it for you. It's really easy to do. You go up one hole, down the next, up the next, down the next, and you continue to do that. Now you'll notice that this ends up skipping a stitch each time. That's okay, we're going to go back to it. What she's doing here is called a running stitch, and you end up with alternating stitches. When you get to the end, you just reverse direction, and you go and you fill in the stitches that are empty, each time going up and down the next hole. So this is the one that I recommend if you have a kid who is stitching or you're new to stitching. It gives great results, and you can see that it's very similar to the back stitch that I just showed you. And here's Lila doing a little Vanna White moment, showing you her stitching. And she also always loves to end by waving to the camera. Our sweet Lila. Okay, and here's mine. That teal color thread, I did that double running stitch so you could see a comparison to the others. It's very similar to the back stitch. All right, the fifth and last stitch I wanted to show you, I call the back stem stitch. Basically, we're doing the stem stitch, which is the first one I showed you, but we're using the back side of it. See that pink stem stitch at the top? Look how pretty it looks on the back. So what I'm going to do is the stem stitch on the other side. So our back of the stitch will show on the front. So I like to start in the second hole, as you can see there, and I go down the last hole. So I'm going to do that from the back side. I'm going to do all of my stitching from the back. And now we're going to do that stem stitch. So I skip a hole, hold the thread over with my finger, and then go back into the hole we skipped. So let's continue that. Skip a hole, hold the thread to the side, go to the hole that we skipped, and continue to do that. So you can see I'm just doing the stem stitch I showed you at the beginning. However, I'm doing it on the back side of the paper so that when we flip this over, we have a beautiful stitch. It looks similar to the back stitch, but it's very clean and it gives you the perfect look. So here, when we end this, I'll flip it over and you can see how perfect that stitch is, even better in comparison to the running or back stitch that are done right before it. So there are a bunch of different options. I like to switch between all of them, and I'm going to show you lots of examples of each of these stitches in today's video. Okay, once I'm done, you'll notice that I had taped my ends. There are many ways to finish off your stitching, many ways. This is what I like to do. I just find it works great for card making. I put some strong liquid adhesive over the back of the stitching. Then I just fold the ends of my string down over it and press it into place. When that glue dries, I can trim off the excess, and that way it stays put and I don't have to worry about having any bulky tape or knots on the back of my project. Okay, let's dive into a bunch of examples. I did tons of stitching along with Lila, and then we assembled them into cards. I'll show you the assembly of a couple, but then just show you the finished product of many. If you want to skip ahead to the next ways to use stitching dies creatively, you're welcome to do that. For this first example and many that I'm going to show, I used the Stamp Market Stampgram stamp set. I just think the images on here are excellent for cards and especially for envelopes, so you'll see me use it many times. So I have a stitched piece here that I finished. I'm adding the sentiment. I like to stamp the sentiment very lightly the first time and then stamp it a few more times, adding a little bit more pressure each time. This helps me to make sure I get a nice, even stamp sentiment, and using the MISTI tool is very helpful for that. Next, I use the Lawn Fawn Just Stitching double rectangle dies, and I use these a lot in today's video. Now this just provides a double stitch line. It doesn't actually cut your paper. So it's just used to add a little bit of interest. So I'll use that on our note card here. This is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2, and it's made from Simon Says Stamp Fog cardstock. I like to use light gray or light silver cardstocks against these white cards with the pop of color, just to add a little bit of contrast. Okay, so now I'm going to assemble this card. I like to use craft foam between my stitch piece and the note card. I find that that added bit of dimension gives a nice look, but it also helps to kind of take away any damage that could happen to your stitching when mailing, because the craft foam has a little give to it. I'm using my new favorite double-sided tape. This is by far my favorite now. It is from Lawn Fawn, and it comes in 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch, and I'm using the 1/4 inch today. I find that this works great for gluing my craft foam in between my layers on my cards. So here's my first example. You can see how I kept it very simple. This is a chain stitch that I did with size 5 floss. And then I also used that same Stamp Market stamp set to stamp a little fun sentiment on my matching envelope. Very simple card design, but it keeps the focus on the stitching. Okay, next I'm going to show you a bit of the assembly of another card before going on to more examples. Remember how I put glue on the end of my strings to hold them down? Once they're dry, this is what I do. I just come and I trim away the excess floss. I'm using these new scissors from Tim Holtz. They look like the old ones, but they don't have that serrated edge. These are the haberdashery scissors. They are super sharp and great for cutting fabric or floss. I'll be using one of my pairs for cutting floss, and the others I'm just going to use on my paper. I really wanted to show these today as I just got them, and I'm very impressed. They've got the nice flexible handle, super sharp. They come in these tins because they are super sharp, and they're just great for card making in general. And you can see the 2 different sizes that I have. I just take the foam out of the case, and I have the foam sitting in my drawer so I can easily get to them. Okay, back to the card design. As you can see, this is a shaped card. I used the new Stamp Market die set. This is the Postcard die set. It comes with that inside rectangle. Then you have the large postage shape, and then the stitching heart die all included. And this coordinates with the Stampgram stamp set that I've shown you many times in this video. You can actually die cut with that large postage stamp and mail it as a postcard if you wanted to, but I wanted to create a typical card. So I die cut 2 of the postage and I put a score line at the top of one of them. Now I'm going to put adhesive on that little flap and glue it to the back of the other die cut. This allows me to create a hinge at the top so this opens and closes like a typical card. Keep in mind this is a unique shape, so I'll have to put it in a bigger envelope. So I ended up mailing mine in a 5x7 envelope. Okay, so here is the completed card. You can see how I stamped the faux envelope lines on the white cardstock piece before adding some stitching using the stem stitch. And then I also stamped a sentiment on there from Concord and 9th and added a silver sparkle heart that I found in my scrap drawer. Here's the Stampgram stamp set that I used to stamp the faux envelope lines, and that coordinates perfectly with the dies that I used. And then for the sentiment on there that says, "I think you're wonderful," it's from this Concord and 9th Lots to Say stamp set. I end up using this set quite a bit throughout this video because I like the simple, small sentiments included. Okay, let's look at a bunch of other examples with similar designs. This one I used the chain stitch with the size 3 floss, so it's nice and fluffy, and you can see the results that you get with that stitch. Under it, I stamped "You Deserve All the Good Stuff" from that Concord and 9th Lots to Say stamp set. Now I put this on a note card. This is Gina K Metallic Silver cardstock, which is one of my favorites. And I used those Lawn Fawn faux stitching rectangle dies to create that faux stitch frame. Now on the envelope for this card and many others throughout this video, I used the Stamp Market Please Deliver to stamp set. I just had to buy this one because it has lots of fun things that you can stamp onto your envelope, and I'm a big fan of decorating them. Okay, this next card is one Lila did. So she did the back stitching on this, and she also had the idea to add those little white pom-poms as clouds, which I thought was brilliant. So I'll show you how to do that on my next card because I had to lift her idea. I thought it was so good. We also have a note card here that is Gina K Silver Metallic cardstock, and we use those Lawn Fawn faux stitch dies for the frame. For the hello, I use the Concord and 9th Lots to Say. Once again, I use that little hello a lot because it fits in small places. So here's my example that I did using that cloud technique. I wanted to show it to you. I just put lots of Gina K Connect liquid glue down right below the rainbow. Then I have a bunch of little white pom-poms here, and I put a cluster into the glue, and then I kind of push them together and then just let it dry. If you give it a couple hours to dry, they will all hold there and you have a fluffy white cloud underneath your rainbow. Here's the finished card. I just stamped a sentiment underneath the rainbow, and then I added it on to a silver note card. That is a stem stitch that you see there, and I actually used some of the 6-ply DMC floss. That's the kind that you can separate and make thinner if you want. So you can see that works great with the stem stitch also. That You Are Some Kind of Wonderful sentiment is from this Stamp Market Just Wonderful stamp set. I've used this one before in videos. And the Cuter Than Email that I stamped on that coordinating envelope over there on the left, that is from the Stampgram stamp set that I've been using throughout this video. Okay, my next example is an all-white card. So I did the stitching on the white panel, and then I added it to a white note card with that faux stitched frame around it. This is a chain stitch that I did with DMC size 5 floss, so it's a little bit thinner. And then I added a little scrap of silver glitter cardstock that I die cut from a heart. The sentiment is from the Waffle Flower Rainbow Bridge stamp set. I really like this set, and I thought the rainbow was perfect for a sympathy card for my friend who lost her pup. Stitching is also great for small quick cards like the one you see here that is 4 1/4 by 4 1/4. Lila asked to add that Pink and Main reverse scallop square die cut frame, that white scallop frame on there, and I thought that was perfect. This is one of her stitch pieces using a running stitch or a double running stitch, and she had the idea to go back and add some shimmer pen onto the thread after she stitched to make it sparkly, which I love. Then we added a sentiment from the Clearly Besotted Simply Said stamp set. This is a great sentiment set where the sentiments are partially script and partially a basic font, so it adds something a little extra special. You'll be seeing me use this one again very soon because it really has every occasion you could possibly need. Okay, on this one I actually stamped a sentiment, but I messed it up, so I just covered it with a sentiment strip. We have a silver note card with the faux stitching around the edge. I really feel like that adds a lot to a simple card. And this is the back stem stitching. Remember where I found the back side gave a perfect result? Look at that. Those stitches are just perfect and so easy to do. The sentiment on this one is from the Mighty Hands U stamp set. And again, I had stamped it poorly, so I just stamped it again and added it on top. And by the way, we had die cut a bunch of these rainbow pieces, took our thread and needle and did the stitching on the go, and then came back to the craft room to make all of these cards at once. So now that we've stitched enough rainbows, let's get a different look from that same rainbow die. In this case, I die cut the rainbow twice, once the correct way and then once upside down, meeting them in the center. And that creates this oval that you see. It's hard to believe this was created with that same rainbow die. For the stitching, I did a basic stem stitch and I used the size 3 floss. That's the fluffiest. So I get this nice dimensional twisted look on top of my cardstock. I trimmed that finished piece down and added it to a note card where we did that faux stitch frame around it. And this is all completely white cardstock. Then I added a Birch Press Big Lingo U die. This is a die that cuts the word U and then also the outline of the word U. So that's how I did it in both white and black. Then there is the My Favorite Things All About You stamp set, where I white heat embossed the sentiment Are Fantastic on a black cardstock strip and added it to my stitching. Let's switch gears here and start using that Hello die that I showed you at the beginning of the video. Along with it, I'm using the Paper Smooches Fab Frames die set. That larger frame die there actually has little holes that you can stitch. On my first example, I'm not going to do any stitching of those holes, but later you'll see me do that. I die cut that from white cardstock, and then I added in the center a stitch piece using that Hello die. I did a basic back stitch as I showed you before, and then I stamped You Are Loved from a Neat and Tangled stamp set. You can see how the little holes of the stitching around it on the frame matches nicely with the stitching in the center, but doesn't distract from it. And by the way, I did use a lot of stamps in this video, different stamp sets. The reason I did that is I have a container on my desk of stamp sets that I really want to use. And oftentimes when I make a bunch of cards at once, I just dig through there for sentiments that'll work on the cards that I'm making. So all of these were in that container and I'm excited I finally got to use them. Okay, on this next card, I actually did 2 different stitching dies. So I first cut with the heart die, then I cut with the hello die. I stitched the heart, then stitched the hello, both with a basic back stitch. I created a note card from that postage die set and kept the rest of the card very simple, didn't even do any stamping. Let's look at a few other simple and quick cards using that heart stitch die. Here I first stamped that faux envelope in the background. Then I did the stitching on top and stamped Hey There Sending Love in the center. I added that onto a note card that I created with the postage die set. Here's a card that Lila did. She did running stitch and she wanted to use cotton candy colors for that. Then she filled her heart with lots of little gemstones that she found in my craft room and stamped hello below that. I thought this was a really clever way to create something that has a great handmade feel to it. Now, before we move on to our next way to use stitching dies, I wanted to show you this example. I used that Paper Smooches frame that had the little holes, and I did stitching on the frame. For this one, I used the Stamp Market Big Greeting stamp set. Now, this is the stamp set. I actually didn't use this stamp set, but I used a die set that coordinates with it. But I wanted to show you that they had this option to use these together. I just used the hello word. It's the hello word, and then there's also a shadow die. But they also have it for the word hi and thank you. I used the hello die and die cut it from black cardstock 3 times and glued them on top of each other and then added that inside of my frame. The white frame die cut that I created with the Paper Smooches die, I just did a rainbow of back stitches around. And then I stamped I Love You from the Neat and Tangled Sentiment stamp set. I like that frame die can be used with or without the stitching and just adds a little bit of interest to your card. Okay, let's move on. The 6th way to use your stitching dies is to get creative, not use your basic stitches like I just showed you, but instead do other things with it, like here, where Lila and I just stretched the thread across the openings of the die cut to create new looks. I'm not going to show these cards in process because they're very simple. We just did giant stitches across the openings. In this case, I started with pink floss, and I did 2 big stitches, and then I made an X, so I went in the other direction. Then I did it with orange, did it with yellow, green, and blue, and you get that fun pattern in the middle where they overlap. Once I was done, I went with silver metallic thread, and I did a stem stitch. The metallic thread is fun, but it really is hard to work with because it kind of comes apart as you're stitching, but there is that option if you're interested. Underneath that, I stamped hello using the Concord and 9th Lots to Say stamp set, and I also stamped a fun sentiment on the matching envelope. Here's another similar card. This time I used the DMC floss in size 3, and then I did a stem stitch with white floss around the outside, and I think I like the white better actually. By the way, I have photos of all of these cards over on my blog, along with the supplies used for each, if you find that helpful, since I'm showing so many cards in this video. Now this one Lila did, she came up with this idea on her own, and I love it. She did big giant stitches for each of each color to kind of stretch across the heart, and then stamped cuter than an email up on the top right. This is probably my favorite of all of them. I thought that was so clever of her. Now all the examples I've shown so far are pretty simple designs. You can step up your stitch cards by adding texture to your card also. So the 7th idea is to stitch over texture. The best way to do this is with embossing folders. Embossing folders are a favorite tool of mine. They're inexpensive and can be used in many ways. I do recommend first die cutting your holes for the stitching. You can see I did the rainbow die there. And then stamping your sentiment. Once you've done that, you put it in an embossing folder and run it through your die cut machine. I don't like to stamp after I do the embossing because you're stamping onto a bumpy surface. So now we can go ahead and do our stitching. I did a basic stem stitch, and I'm adding some Tonic Aqua Shimmer Pen onto the stitching. This was Lila's idea. I showed you her example earlier, and I just basically painted it on there. It's hard to see in the video, but in real life, that makes your thread sparkly. I don't really like the metallic threads that are out there. I think they're kind of hard to work with. So this is a better way for me to get a shiny look to my string. Now I did trim that down, and I added it onto a silver note card that I made from Gina K cardstock. And there we have the idea of adding texture to our background before we do our stitching. And by the way, I wanted to show you again that You Brighten My Day sentiment is from this Neat and Tangled typed sentiment stamp set. I just feel like that message goes so nicely with the rainbow. Okay, we're on to our 8th way of using stitching dies creatively, and that is to stitch over your stamping. So by putting your stitching together with your stamping, you can get really cool layered looks. Let's first look at a very simple example. In this case, I stamped a background before I did my die cutting and stitching. So I stamped a background from Simon Says Stamp called Love Is. And I stamped that with a super light ink. That's Simon Says Stamp Fog Ink, which is a favorite of mine. I then did that back stem stitch for the stitched rainbow. That's the stitch where I actually used the back side to get a perfect looking stitch. I then stamped You Are Loved a Lot underneath it with black ink, and then added it to a note card with the faux stitched frame. The sentiment is from My Favorite Things More Essential Sentiment Stamp Set. This is one of those sets that has lots of clever greetings in it, and I thought this one was perfect for this particular card. Okay, now let's step up the stamping that we do with the stitching. On this example and my next one, I used the Stamp Market Citrus Vine stamp set. When I saw this in stores, I had to buy it because I thought it was so clever. You can do layering with it and keep a very simple card design. You can do both flowers and fruit. So I'll do one example of each. After die cutting the word hello from my cardstock, I'm going to arrange my stamping around it. I'm using a MISTI stamping tool, but you definitely don't need to. The reason I chose to is I'm going to do some double inking on my images. So I stamped the branch first with Hero Art's soft sand ink. And now I'm using a sponge dauber and a slightly darker soft brown ink to just put ink on parts of the same stamp image and then add that to my cardstock. So it gives you that two-tone look. Now I'm going to go ahead and stamp some leaves, and I'll actually do the same thing with the leaves. I'll first ink it up and stamp with Hero Art's soft green ink. I will then use a sponge dauber and use a slightly darker green ink, which is Hero Art's Mowed Lawn Green, and add that just to part of the stamp. So see how I'm using the sponge dauber with part of the stamp? And that gives you that two-tone look again. This is a great way to give dimension or the look of dimension to a stamped image, and you can use two inks that way. So I'll continue to do this. I use Shell Pink from W+9 for the flower, and I stamped that a couple times just to make it a little bit darker. And then I added the layering image onto that with Hero Art's Bubblegum ink. I repeated that stamping to cover the entire front of the card, and now I'm doing a running stitch for the hello. This is super fast. This is the one Lila likes, where I go through and I do every other stitch, and then I reverse directions and fill in the empty stitches. That works really well with this particular die because it has so many twists and turns. Once I finished my stitching, I added that piece with craft foam onto a note card that I made with the postage die. I also stamped a few extra flowers and die cut them with the coordinating dies. And then I'm adding that in various places on the front of the card, including the spot where I got brown ink where I didn't want it. So sometimes you can stamp and cut out extra images to cover up any mistakes you make. So let's look at the completed card here. That background I made from basic craft cardstock. And I also added a few gemstones here and there to the front to hide more little ink bloopers that I had. I really like the look of that stitching on top of the stamped background. I did make sure that my stamping was a little bit lighter and my thread was a little bit darker so that the stitched word would stand out. Okay, let's do another example very similar using the same stamp set, but this time I'm going to use the citrus images in the set. I like that you can get two very different themed cards out of one set. So I stamped the outside with a darker yellow. That is Gina K Wild Dandelion. Now I'm going to stamp the inside with citrus ink from Altenew, and that's a lighter ink. And then I come in and stamp the solid image too. So I'm just choosing 3 different colors of yellow and then layering them together. Now these aren't meant to be perfect layered images. They're supposed to look kind of artsy, and I really love that look. I have a hard time achieving it on my own, so I'm always happy when a stamp set comes along and makes it easy for me. And then, of course, I added some leaves where I did the two-tone coloring using a sponge dauber. So I continued all of my stamping, and then I added some orange stitching for the hello, and again I did the running stitch. You can see how I did some oranges in the background using 3 shades of orange ink, and they're the exact same images. I like that you can get so much from that stamp set, and then I stamped You Brighten My Day underneath it from the Neat and Tangled Sentiment stamp set. Now the 9th way to use your stitching die creatively is to actually not stitch at all and instead just use the little holes as a pattern to place little embellishments. I use tiny gems, but you could use beads, pearls, drops of Nuvo drops, whatever you may have on hand. I'm going back to that rainbow die because I love it so much. I cut it from white cardstock and I'm putting adhesive on the back, and I'm gluing that to another piece of white cardstock so the holes have a backing to it. Now I'm just going to put drops of liquid adhesive into the holes and add gemstones on top. Now I like to use Gina K Connect. I find that is a super strong adhesive and it'll hold those gems in place as it goes through the mail. And I use my jewel picker to pick up each little gemstone and add it into the adhesive. Now I could have probably placed all of these gems on my own into a rainbow shape, but this helps me get quick, easy placement, and I know that the results will end up really nice. I wanted to create a frame to go around this, but I didn't want the scallop on that paper Smooches frame, so I die cut it and then I just cut off the scallop part. So now I have a frame with those little holes, and I thought it would go nicely with this card design. It's fun to change up your die cuts to get different looks. Now I'm using Darice thin foam strips. These are great. I forgot that I had them, and I found some in my drawer, and they are wonderful, a new favorite again of mine. And I put those around the outside edge of that frame. Since there's a small area, these thin little strips of foam tape work perfect. So now I can put that on the center of a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I'm filling the center with liquid adhesive and then popping my little embellishment rainbow in the center. This card really didn't take that long to put together, and can you imagine getting in the mail? I mean, it would just have to lift your spirits to see all that sparkling color. Now, I did stamp "You Mean the World to Me" underneath it with black ink, and that is from this Birch Press Lingo Thanks stamp set. So this card and a few of the stitching ones, Lila and I will be selling at her lemonade stand. She always sells something crafty. We made a few cards in our last video for it, and we thought these might sell well too. Okay, we're in the home stretch of this entirely way too long video. This is number 10, and this idea is to allow color to peek through the little holes that you create with your stitching die. Super easy, and you can use up your tiny little scraps for this. So I die cut the rainbow from white cardstock, and I'll use that on my card. And then I put a pink scrap of cardstock behind it, and I'm putting little pencil dots through the top part of the rainbow. Now I'm using my scissors to cut around those dots so that I can create an arch that's the perfect size. Notice that I'm not cutting it perfectly. It doesn't matter. You just need to make sure you don't cut through the dots, but rather around it. I repeated that process with the other arches on the rainbow in other colors of cardstock. Again, dig through your scraps. This is perfect for that. I then put adhesive on the back of my white die cut piece and arrange each of the arches in place. This will allow the color to show through. By the way, instead of erasing the pencil dots, I just put them down upside down so you don't see the dots through on the other side. This is fast and easy and a great way to use those small little pieces. So here's the final card. I kept everything white so that the color would stand out even more in the center. I again used the paper Smooches fab frame die for that scallop die cut with the tiny little holes in it. I could allow color to show through those holes too, but again, I wanted the focus on the rainbow. I stamped "Hello" from the Concord and 9th Lots to Stay stamp set, and we have the last card of the video. I really appreciate the amount of time you've taken to spend with me in this long video, and as a little secret reward for anybody still watching at this point, if you leave "Share Handmade Kindness" in a comment below, I'll pick a few people to send cards to. I really appreciate the time you spend here. All of the supplies I use are linked below in my YouTube description, and my blog has lots of photos and information to help organize through all of these examples. In the middle are a couple other stitching videos. Thank you so much for your time. We'll see you soon and have a wonderful day.